The title of my talk I was given was More Actors in a Larger and Unpredictable Battlefield. And the battlefield I'm going to be talking about is space. I use that as an example. And the landscape of space has changed quite dramatically since the beginning of the first space age. We look from the late 1950s, early 1960s to now. When it started, it was two states, US and Soviet Union. And that was very much everything was happening within the background context of the Cold War. What we have now, as I said, is very different. We have so many more actors, more states, and also commercial companies. And that is only increasing. So what we have just from that is a much more complex environment and having to balance the ambitions and the intents of all these different actors. So space now is referred, the narrative is that space is no longer a sanctuary. I do disagree with this slightly, that it wasn't, but I think the idea that space is purely peaceful, that it's only used for peaceful purposes, is pretty much agreed that's no longer true. So we have this very complex, very contested environment. And the first part of that is just in the number of satellites. There are approximately 2,000 to 3,000 functioning satellites at the moment, and that is increasing very rapidly. We see particularly mega constellations from private companies like SpaceX, which are planning on putting tens of thousands of satellites into orbit. Most of this is occurring in low Earth orbit, but we're also seeing increases in medium Earth and geostationary orbit as well. So how do we manage that? Along with the number of satellites, we also have increasing amounts of space debris. Some of this is naturally occurring, just satellites breaking up, but some of this is also from kinetic strikes against satellites and collisions between them. So how do we manage this debris? How do we understand where it's moving? How do we ensure that collisions aren't happening? So we need space situational awareness and space traffic management in order to do this. The difficulty is that this has primarily been a function of militaries. So a lot of the information is classified. It's how do we ensure that that information is best shared internationally amongst all actors to try and manage what is happening in space. Alongside the number of satellites and the management of the traffic, we also have an increase in counter space capabilities. I use this term very strongly, not space weapons. Trying to define a weapon in space is incredibly difficult. And the term counter space capability also allows us to include those threats to the non-space-based aspects of these architectures. So it could be the jamming of terrestrial receivers, the targeting of ground stations, cyber attacks, and the like. And these span quite a huge spectrum. So on one end, we have kinetic anti-satellite missiles. These destroy a satellite, increasing a huge amount of debris as well, which is one of the main problems with them. Moving through a number of non-kinetic capabilities. So we're looking at the development of lasers which can actually dazzle the optical sensors of satellites, the use of high-powered microwave frequencies, for example, to interfere with internal electronics, cyber capabilities, rendezvous and proximity operations, satellites being able to approach other satellites. We don't necessarily know what they might be doing. We have GPS jamming, spoofing of GPS signals. So we have this whole range of capabilities there. And tied to that as well, we have dual use technologies. On one side, again, there's two parts to this. We have those satellites which are dual use in terms of civilian and military. So that might be in terms of ISR or communications. But we also have the development of technologies for civilian or scientific purposes, which could be repurposed. And those are based around rendezvous and proximity operations, particularly in terms of debris removal or on-orbit satellite servicing. So we're looking at people who are developing satellites to approach an old broken satellite or large piece of debris, actually capture it and drag it into the atmosphere, remove it from orbit. Of course, if you can do that to a piece of debris, you can do it to a functioning satellite. There are, of course, a lot of legal issues here as well, but there is definitely concern about some of these technologies and how they might be used. And of course, space, there are lots of things that we can't control. One of those aspects we're most worried about is solar activity, is space weather. A massive solar event which could cause a huge amount of damage to satellites in orbit. And how do we plan for that? So we have this incredibly complex environment that we're all trying to function in. And it means that military activity in space isn't always clear cut. It's not always obvious. There could be a lot of confusion. We have concerns about attribution and proving intent as well, and miscalculation, which could lead to a response where it's maybe unwarranted. If your satellite stops functioning, it's not easy always to know the reason why. You can't just go up to it and pull it apart and figure out what happened. It could have been a micro debris strike. It could have been some radiation, could just be a fault. It could be nefarious activity. So when we have more actors, dual purpose capabilities, and all these different things going on, it can mean even understanding that and proving any activity is so much more difficult, which again is why we need this sharing of information to actually understand, to be able to have a better view of what happened, to ensure that if we are responding to an action, we know how we should be doing that and why. And of course, this complexity, this confusion is only going to keep increasing as we move into the future. We are going to continue to see more actors come in, whether that's more commercial companies, more civilian agencies, and also more military actors. We had the US, we had the Soviet Union. US and Russia are still huge players here. China is now a major military space player. The UK now has a director space. We're going to have a space command. France has been making moves in this direction. India, Japan, NATO has now declared space as an operational domain. So we're going to see a lot more military activity, not necessarily in terms of targeting satellites, but in the use of space. And alongside that, also the potential for the use of proxies, which just adds another level of complexity. I mentioned the commercial companies, again, more and more of these. And we're also going to see them having almost more of a majority stake in space. The number of satellites is going to far outweigh the military, the state-based satellites. And also some of them have a bit of technological supremacy. They can take risks that states often can't. We see this particularly with SpaceX and their ability to reuse rockets. And we're going to continue, I think, to see commercial companies developing some capabilities that are surpassing state-based and military-based capabilities. We're also going to see increased activity in the lunar area. Maybe aware that a few years ago, China landed a rover on the far side of the moon. And whilst this was a very significant technical achievement, it also did create some concern about whether the moon was going to be a new strategic high ground. There is a lot of debate about that. What do we mean by a high ground and whether that's true? But although the lunar missions that are being planned are, about science and about exploration, the technologies required to do these could again cause some concern. And also there is just that sort of power play, that balance in space that we see, particularly between the big actors. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. A little bit further into the future, we're going to see things like asteroid mining potentially. There's estimated to be trillions of dollars worth of resources on asteroids. So the ability to bring these resources back, lots of economic impacts, lots of legal impacts, the potential of on-orbit manufacturing as well, and how that might change the capabilities that states have. So we just have, it's like an onion, you just keep layers and layers and layers of complexity about how we operate in space. But of course, some of the big questions are, what is the potential for an actual conflict in space? People often talk about this. Are we going to have a real war, a shooting war in space? And so there are some arguments as to why this is not necessarily the narrative to go down. First off, is the use of counter space capabilities, certain ones. We know that states have tested kinetic ASAT missiles. There was a very infamous 2007 Chinese test, an Indian test. Russia has been testing some of the capabilities in the last year. But these produce a huge amount of debris, and that affects everyone in space. It is an overt, aggressive act if you do this to another state's satellite. So there are questions as to whether these would be used, or whether this is about deterrence, it's about projecting your own power and posturing in space. So are these counter space capabilities that are likely to be used more in that sub-threshold, that constant competition, and it's more the short-term denial of space rather than destroying satellites. We see a lot of move towards creating norms of behavior in space. This is to try and catch up a little bit with the technology in terms of international agreements and treaties. The Outer Space Treaty is quite old. So how do we understand norms? How do we look at rendezvous and proximity operations, and how close you can get to other satellites in sort of agreed distances beyond which you're within your rights to say you're too close. I can respond. We do have ongoing discussions in the arms control community about some of these counter space capabilities. Some concern as to whether these are realistic, but we do expect perhaps some movement in this way. And I think the biggest is that space is so important in so many different areas. It's not just the military, it's national security, it's economics, the international financial system and trade. And so anything that leads to the loss of use of space is going to have huge global impacts. You can't guarantee that any action you take will not affect you. So the question really, does anyone want a conflict in space, or are we going to see that that fear of crossing a line into a full-blown conflict? There is no winner there, and I think winning in this context is just the continued ability to operate in space and to freely operate in space. It's either that, and we learn how to continue within a complex environment, within with knowing about these capabilities and how to deal with them, or everyone loses. People like to talk about a new space race, but how do we guarantee a winner there? I think that understanding that there is no winner, that we shouldn't necessarily approach our operations in that way, is perhaps the best route to take to ensure that space continues to be of benefit to all of us. I think I'll finish there, and I look forward to the questions.